is the first part of two parts video looking at chapter 2 of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So if we start off thinking about what actually happens in the chapter, a quick summary is that Mr. Utterson goes home after his walk with his cousin and checks Jekyll's will. He then decides to take a visit to Dr. Lanyon to ask whether he knows anything about Mr. Hyde. He has a nightmare because he's full of unease about the situation with his friend. He then decides to try and spy on Mr. Hyde and finally has a visit to Jekyll's house to see whether that sheds any light on the mystery. So we start off looking at this chapter. The first highlighted bits show us as readers that we should be trusting Utterson. He is a reliable narrator. He has sombre spirits, dry divinity. He goes soberly and gratefully to bed. So he is a measured, rational and reasonable narrator whose point of view we should be trusting. If we go down to the bottom of the page, this highlight is emphasising the fact that this is a mystery. There is a real sense of the Gothic to this, with the idea that Dr. Jekyll's disappearance or unexplained absence for any period of time is like, well, why is Dr. Jekyll highlighting or anticipating the fact that he might mysteriously disappear? So again, it very firmly places the narrative in the Gothic tradition. If we turn over onto page 56, the first highlight is this document had long been the lawyer's eyesore. And this is emphasising not just that Utterson doesn't like the clause in the will because it seems strange, but symbolically seems to represent Utterson's dislike of ambiguity and mystery, particularly moral ambiguity. And it's again giving us that insight into Utterson's character. If we continue down the page to the definite presentment of a fiend, is this idea that it's sort of personifying the threat that Utterson had already detected in the will, and it's giving it a sort of absolute form rather than it just being an idea that he felt uneasy with. Now he's uneasy with the actual physicality and existence of Mr. Hyde. We've got the emotive language that is an obnoxious paper. It's a disgrace, which seems to be not particularly lawyer-like. If we think Utterson is so often presented to us as dry and a little bit sort of reticent about emotion, it's very interesting here that his reaction to the will is so emotional. Then if we move on to his visit to Cavendish Square and Dr. Lanyon, we are hearing how respectable this man is. So if you're thinking about social class of the time, a doctor would be seen as a professional. He would not be lower class. He would be firmly within the ranks of the affluent, not upper class, but absolutely someone full of respectability. And I think the solemn butler, referring to him as the great Dr. Lanyon, all emphasise those ideas. If we continue down page 56 to the highlighted quotation, the geniality, as was the way of the man, was somewhat theatrical to the eye, but it reposed on genuine feeling. So again here, Dr. Lanyon is being presented to us in total contrast to Mr. Hyde as a character that we should trust. So when he's speaking and giving information, it is somebody that we should be feeling is reliable and rational. Moving over now onto page 57. If we look at the first highlighted bit, Henry Jekyll became too fanciful for me. He began to go wrong in mind. Such unscientific balderdash. So if we're thinking about that in terms of excellent quotations to remember, saying that Dr. Jekyll went wrong in mind, it's a fantastic, easy one to remember. You've got a little bit of AO2 in there when you're talking about the repetition of wrong, just to show how strongly Lanyon feels about it. but it also is a really interesting point in terms of AO3 and context, because we are thinking about science and progress. At this point in the 19th century, there was a massive acceleration in scientific discovery, and with that, there was the worry about what underpinned society anymore. If we think about before Darwin, it was a genuinely Christian belief that everybody had, that their place was decided by God. God had created the world, and yet Darwin, with his The Origin of Species, threw this into doubt. And if you think about it, to us it's a very accepted idea, but when it was new and novel, it threw into doubt people's ideas about faith, about identity. So when Dr. Jekyll is being accused by Lanyon of becoming too fanciful and its unscientific balderdash, we have to see it within this context of a huge advancement in scientific discovery, and consequently the sort of philosophical and scientific and social doubts that came along with it. If we carry on down the page, we've got the estrangement. That comes from a Greek legend. It's a very famous falling out between two close friends. So that emphasises that Dr. Lanyon and Jekyll were very close friends initially. If we go down a little bit further to the highlight, that was the amount of information that the lawyer carried back with him to the great dark bed. We've got this idea that he is methodical, he's working like a detective now. So Utterson is treating this like a case that he has to solve, which obviously is mirrored in the title of the novel. And when we have got that it's nighttime, a mere darkness, again, there's a symbolism. Not only is it literally nighttime and it is dark, but Utterson feels in the dark about what is happening. If we continue now over to page 58, we have here this idea about his imagination was also engaged, or rather enslaved. So we've got the fear in the 19th century of the irrational. With the rise of scientific discovery, there is a fear of those things that are not seen in a rational light. And I think that plays in very well to the idea of the Gothic, some things being mysterious and unexplained. And if we go down a little bit further to the idea of a nocturnal city, again, we've got the pathetic fallacy of things being at night time, that they're hidden. It's being reflected in Utterson's view of London in his dream. But we also see London again being anthropomorphized or personified in seeing as a creature that is alive and is almost part of the whole story. And in The Nightmare, we've also got this idea of the symbolism, not just Utterson seeing what has happened in his dream, what Enfield has spoken about, but also a contemporary fear at the end of the 19th century that progress was sort of like a juggernaut in the way that Mr. Hyde was, that it was coursing through society and trampling vulnerable members in this sort of huge race to complete progress and move forward through the Industrial Revolution, through this idea of enlightenment. And that, yes, he is dreaming about what Mr. Enfield has said about Mr. Hyde, but also it's symbolic of the fear of what society was doing to humanity. If we go down a little bit further to the highlight, the figure had no face by which he might know it. Emphasises again this air of mystery in the novel, and the final highlight on this page was the habit of mysterious things when well examined. And that again shows that Utterson is a truly rational, intelligent human being, and therefore puts him again in this position as being a very trustworthy narrator. If we turn the page now to page 59, I'm going to go down as far as if he be Mr. Hyde, he had thought, I shall be Mr. Seek. So that play on words, Hyde with a Y and Hyde with an I. At the top of page 59, it is this reaction that people have to Hyde, the immediate revulsion that seems to be intrinsic in seeing Mr. Hyde is a man who was without bowels of mercy. So people feel a spirit of enduring hatred when they see Mr. Hyde. And even though Utterson at this point has not seen him, he has very much taken away that idea from his cousin and his description of him. Then we have this change in the narrative that Utterson is beginning to spy on Mr. Hyde, that he absolutely wants to track down who he is and find out a little bit more about him. He's beginning to take on the role of the detective, and as I've mentioned before, we should trust him as the narrator because he is rational and respectable. So I'm going to finish this chapter summary in the next video, where we'll be looking at what happens between this point and the end of chapter 2. Thank you.